All right, good morning, everybody. All right, so I'm going to talk about race and racial equity before 9 a.m. on a Monday. Nice and early. All right, but I think we can do it. But let me ease us into this conversation a little bit by telling you all a personal story, story from my family. And people who've been to these water cooler conferences have probably heard about my daughter, Naya. Naya, she's now 11 years old. And both my wife and I have been working in this movement for decades. And, so that means our kids grew up going to a lot of events, community events in the evenings or what have you. And luckily, there's a lot of childcare on the side of some of these events. And there was a particular evening, Naya was maybe about 3 or 4. She was about 4. And she went to the child care section during the event. My wife was working the event, and then afterwards they're driving home, and my daughter Naya is upset. She's upset about something, and she's just kind of fuming. And my wife asks, "Hey, so what's going on? What's the matter?" And Naya says, "These 2 boys kept on coming up to me and calling me Chinese baby. Chinese baby this, Chinese baby that." And so my wife says, oh, this is, to herself, this is one of those moments, right? This is my daughter's first time sort of being racialized in a particular way, and how's she going to accept it, how's she going to hold it, how's she going to push back on some of this stuff. She was sort of getting geared up for that conversation as they were driving up the 110. And then at some point, my daughter says, the thing is, I'm not a baby. That was the thing that was holding my daughter down. She's 4 years old. She's not a baby. It's true, right? But one of the things that we as adults understand is that this question of race is constantly upon us, right? As a father, I want to address the thing that my daughter is so upset about, the fact that she's not a baby. But we also understand how race is still yet this obstacle for us to get to the better part of ourselves, the better conversation, right? It's the part of our founding as a country that still holds us back from realizing our fullest potential, right? I would love to have a conversation about when she turned from a baby to a kid, but we also need to have this conversation about race, and so that's why we're here today and having these conversations. The other thing that I think it's sort of important to note is that race, like many things that have to do with power and privilege, had been baked into our systems for generations. Many of the disparities that we'll be talking about were unfortunately designed for, and they were designed for generations ago. And whoever might be in charge now, whoever might be in leadership of some of these systems, we need to work with them to be unflinching and rigorous about going into these systems and rooting these things out, because they were designed for and built in generations ago when the values of California were very different, right? And so we need to redesign these systems for the values for today, and that's why we decided to reach out to our partners and to launch this project called Race Counts. A couple of things about Race Counts and why we started it as an organization. For those of us who've been here in California, we probably had noticed for some time, particularly after the 90s, how we all got very comfortable not talking about race as a state. We were all pretty traumatized, I think, collectively in the 90s. We had a lot of things going on, and there was sort of this gentle person's agreement to shift the conversation to socioeconomics, to zip codes, to geography, to things besides race. But, when there's a ghost in the machine and you don't talk about it, it's going to find its way out. And there's too many times and too many ways that we miss the mark by not talking about race. But we also are all very clear here, those of us who are serious about this endeavor, that when you want to get serious about racial disparities and structural racism, it's hard to get our arms around the question, right? It's hard to see how one system interacts with another system. It's hard to see how it plays out in different parts of California. And so one of the things that we thought about, is that California needed sort of a new higher resolution MRI scan to be able to look below the surface to really put our eyes on this issue and say, hey, how does this play out in Fresno versus LA versus the Bay Area? How do these systems interact? And how do we start setting some goals to actually closing down these darn achievement gaps? And so that's sort of another part of why we started this project. The last thing I'll mention about why we started this is that, we collectively felt that we needed to have a different kind of conversation about race, one that was generative, one that was directional, one that would say, hey, here's certainly where things are going wrong, but this is what we can do about it, and how do we start moving us in that direction? And so that, again, is another reason why we started this. So let me now show you guys a little bit about the project. So what is Race Counts? I would say, first and foremost, it's a partnership, one where research and advocacy and organizing can all kind of come together. The first two groups that we called to start this project would be California Calls and Pico, California, some of the largest organizing entities up and down the state. And we also spoke to about 85 different organizations up and down the state in the design and launch of this project. We also spoke to Dr. Manuel Pastor, who I don't know how many folks know who Dr. Manuel Pastor is. Yes, you can't use the word equity without him like magically appearing somehow, and so we of course partnered with USC. And so besides this partnership, we again wanted to create this sort of new and different kind of analytical framework for us to understand race, to understand it at a local level, and to think about what we can do about this. Of course, we made a pretty website, so there's racecounts.org, which you can all jump on at any point. And then it's and then what, right? So what are we going to do about this? And so what you'll be seeing for this project over time is policy reports released focused on very specific issues, showing where we're doing well and where we're not in the state, and again, digging in a little bit more about what's next for us. The data, there's a lot of data on this system and on this website, and there's two ways to create a data indicator list. For those of you who do that in your spare time. One way would be to review all the literature and to see what academics say about what's the most important things to track around data around racial inequities. The other is to ask organizers what they're fighting on and what their issues that they see on the ground. We actually decided to do both of those things together. Right? So we did a full literature review, we spoke to organizers, and that's how we compiled the data set. The data set breaks down into about 7 issue areas. Okay, from housing, healthy built environment, economic opportunity, education, democracy, so on and so forth. Again, all co-designed with our partners. And we broke that down by 44 indicators, right? So every issue area has about 5 to 8 different indicators. Okay, what's good and interesting about this is that there's a lot of times people will track median household income in terms of what the disparities might look like by race, but because organizers had pushed us on this, we're also tracking, who's a manager or director at a position versus frontline staff, and sort of what's the mobility track in terms of the kind of employment. Okay, so we had all of these 44 indicators broken down by these issue areas, and we decided to rank them in every county for every issue area and for every indicator. Okay, so all of this is on the site, and what's coming soon, actually very soon, we're putting final touches on it this week, would be looking at cities over 60,000 and then large school districts. And we have a special treat for you because we're actually going to show you a little bit about the large school districts. So some of the quick things about top line findings before I get into some of the actual data. Let me see here. One of the things to note is that when we looked throughout the state, there was unfortunately no part of the state that was devoid of racial disparities, right? We all understand that. And actually, it's just a matter of variance of how much burden there is. By race, we found that Black Californians are by far burdened with the highest number and to the greatest extent of racial disparities across our issue areas and across our indicators. But the Latino population actually is burdened by the greatest number of individuals impacted by these disparities. For the API community writ large, doing well, but of course you find very stark disparities when you start to break it down by racial ethnic groups. And we have a lot of data on the indigenous community. We've been told more so than many projects like this, but we still don't have enough. And we keep speaking to our partners in the Native American community about how there's this dynamic of erasure or genocide by data, by the continuous loss and inability to track some of these issues means that their voices get submerged. And so some of the quick things that we found, on the 7 issue areas that we had laid out, as you can imagine, the most disparate issue was crime and justice. Okay? The second would be housing, and the third is education. So when you want to think about, hey, if we want to get serious about closing down racial equity disparities and taking California to that next level, it's those 3 top issues that really we're burdened with now. Okay? But we want to look at this at the local area, and so we decided to create this new view of racial disparity, this sort of 3-dimensional view of racial disparity. And so we created this sort of 3-dimensional scatter plot, which is a lot of fun. Okay? And the way that we did it is we took every county and we put them up and down on the scatter plot depending on what's their overall performance. Everybody in that county averaged together how well are they doing on any one of those issues. Okay? And then how much racial difference you would find in that county is left and right. Okay? If you are more racially disparate, your county would go further to the right. Okay? Versus less so would go further to the left. And then the size of each of these bubbles on the scatter plot would be the amount of individuals impacted by that level of disparity or that level of performance. Okay? So up and down is performance, left and right is disparity, and the size is the number of people impacted. Okay? So let me now show you how the state of California breaks down by all 58 counties. Okay? So again, up and down is performance. Left and right would be disparity. And so there is an interesting outlier here on the upper right. Which county in California do you think is in the upper right, performing the best of all counties in California? Starts with an M. Yeah, Marin, right? So there's Marin. Okay? Marin is by far the best performing county across all of our indicators, but it is also the most racially disparate. Okay? When we launched this thing late last year, the media really loved to harp on that particular issue. Everyone loved to bag on Marin for some reason. And so we got quite a bit of coverage on that particular piece. Now, on the very bottom part of the scatter plot, right here on the bottom left, you'll actually find Merced struggling with the lowest performance, but not as great racial disparity. Okay? Now, do I think it means it's fine for people of color in Merced? I do not. I actually think that everybody in Merced is struggling, and so the level of difference you find is lessened. Okay? We should note at this point that having everybody struggling is not our recommended path to racial equity. Okay? All right, but you do find over time this sort of typology, right, of how systematic structural racism plays out differently in different parts of the state, right? You actually find that the Bay Area, right, San Francisco, Alameda, Marin, San Mateo, all sort of float in the sort of upper right quadrant, meaning that they're performing generally very well, right, but have more racial disparities than most. Okay? We call sort of counties that float in this area prosperity for the few. And if you've driven at all through the Bay Area, right, you know what that's about. Okay? At the same time, we actually see a lot of Central Valley counties sort of floating towards the bottom of performance. Okay? Where, again, there's a lot of people struggling, some to the left where there's less racial disparity, and some still to the right, like Fresno and Imperial, so people are struggling, but they're still treating people of color much worse. Okay? So again, you find this sort of typology of disparity, and what we're looking at here is then what do you do about this? Okay? Depending on where you're at the scatter plot, what we're looking at is how do you actually start to move your entire county further to the upper left? right? Higher performing and less disparity. And that's not always something that our elected officials do perfectly well, is to look at two different dynamics and try to go for both goals, right? Sometimes when we say, hey, our housing numbers are really low, people will start building units left and right, and without concerning ourselves with disparity, you could actually see a place start to drift to the right, okay? So how do we get everyone over to the upper left? How do we make sure that we think about performance and closing racial gaps at the same time? That's sort of the directionality part of this whole game, okay? Let's see here. So I'm going to now dig us through and talk a little bit. So there's a website, as I mentioned, racecounts.org. You can get on. It's a lot of fun. These bubbles sort of move around the scatter plots. You could pick any issue area. You could pick any county, any region, okay? I could pick the Central Valley. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of the counties in the Central Valley will sort of float to the bottom there in terms of performance. What you also see, what you also can see here is their ranking, okay, by performance and disparity. And you also then can see how they're playing out across the issue areas, because it's the intersection of these silos that we really want to keep our eyes on, right? We actually can see in some ways that the reason why Fresno is doing so poorly is that it struggles in terms of in the red at low performance and high disparity across 6 of the 7 issue areas, right? And what we also find a lot of times is like in Kern, right, you find actually a few counties where in criminal justice, if they're doing poorly there, they're also doing poorly in democracy, right? And you can kind of guess why, given the disenfranchisement that happens when your system involved, okay? We also, of course, see some counties where housing and education are interlinked, okay? And when you're struggling in one, you might be struggling in the other, okay? And of course, because some of you look like real geeks, you can actually dig in here and actually say, okay, what's going on in that county by each of those indicators and what's the stats by race, okay? And you can see in Fresno, actually employment levels across races is not a problem, but who has a managerial position versus who doesn't, that's really where Fresno seems to be struggling, okay? And in Fresno, if you're black, you're 40 times more likely to be incarcerated than if you're API, 40 times. Okay, so you can get some of that data and pull that right out, okay? This is interesting. LA, it's the big one, right? It's the big honkin' circle, right? And it sits there towards the bottom. What's interesting about LA is that it actually, you know, we sort of hold ourselves up as this real Shangri-La for the entire country. But we perform kind of similar to San Bernardino and Tulare in a lot of ways, okay, when it comes to both performance and racial disparity. And one of the main reasons why is that there's LA when you look at all the indicators, sort of sitting there towards the bottom and towards the middle in terms of disparity. But when you look at just one indicator like incarceration, there goes LA shifting immediately to the right. Okay, when it comes to incarceration, we are wildly over-reliant, almost addicted to incarcerating all of our problems. And we are hugely racially disparate on that, okay? We're number 2, just behind Sutter County, okay? That's not necessarily a race we want to be winning, okay? So now looking at education stuff. So looking at some of the education data, here's all of our education indicators pulled together, okay? Again, upper echelon would be higher performing, lower is lower performing, and left and right is disparity. In the Central Valley, you actually see similar to when you look at all indicators, the Central Valley is generally struggling in either the yellow or the red categories, okay? But all the counties around Fresno seems to be where there are even more racial disparities, okay, when it comes to our education indicators. The Bay Area sits in this sort of high performing, but higher disparity again. And LA sits like it does normally with all the indicators altogether, lower performing with moderate sized disparity, okay? What we're gonna show you now is something that we have yet to release publicly, which is how this data plays out by school districts, okay? What we've been asked by our organizing partners is to start breaking things down to city levels, because at the county it's just a bit too large, and we matched up all the big school districts to those cities. And we have about 126 school districts on here. And so for high school graduation, you see some of the results here. There is one school district that you can barely even see on the plot. Okay, unfortunately, that's Oakland Unified School District, and you see it there on the very bottom right corner. Okay, in terms of performing the worst, in terms of, at least for this 126 school districts, and then with the most racial disparity. LAUSD is not doing very well right next to it. Okay, you see the big circle there for LAUSD. And then you see counties like Vallejo, San Bernardino, Fresno, so on and so forth. Math proficiency for third grade. Also, you see LA there, but you see Oakland, again, sort of floating there to the very far right in terms of racial disparity. Okay. I don't want to end this all on bad news sort of note. There are things that we can do, particularly when we think about how to build different kinds of coalitions and different lenses on these issues. And so one of the things that we had spoken about at previous water coolers is the idea of thinking about equity when it comes to budgeting at the local school district level. And we've seen this at times with local control funding formula passed, that for local school districts, the spirit of that law didn't, and that formula didn't necessarily roll through every local school district. Okay, and so for LAUSD, the Advancement Project California partnered with the Community Coalition and ICS to actually use data to say, hey, within LAUSD, now that LAUSD is going to get nearly $1 billion more from LCFF because of high-need students, where are those high-need students concentrated by school site? And let's make sure that those schools get the lion's share of that money. Okay, we first proposed this in 2014. We cut the data by about 12 indicators, and you can actually see where in LAUSD are the highest concentrations of those particular high-need, high-concentrated schools. Okay, what I'm happy to announce in April of this year, we actually were able to pass a resolution with LAUSD that actually indeed resolved an updated student equity need index that would target more dollars to those school sites, and a commitment to shift about $260 million a year of that LCFF dollars into those high-need schools, okay? And then to provide those school site leaders with a menu of options about what it might do with that additional money to start lowering some of these disparities, okay? So there are active things that we can be doing to really address some of these issues. The last thing I'll say before I move us to the panel would be that while we're all very clear that these racial disparities were baked into the education system that we've inherited, and while it's incumbent upon us to be very rigorous when we interrogate these systems, there's also a long-standing conversation among scholars and something that advocates on the ground have known for forever, is that we need to look at reforms on campus as well as outside of the campus in terms of lowering some of these disparities, right? That it's essential for us to have eyes on what things we can be doing in class to lower these gaps, as well as right outside. So for example, when I mentioned Oakland Unified and it's really struggling around disparities with graduation, it also has similar high levels of disparities on home ownership, similar high levels of disparities on median household income. And this is what we're starting to explore, is that where we're finding these confluences, right, we need to really start figuring out how these systems intersect, interact, and really sort of conspire to hold some of these students down. The closing point for me will be that as we have a growing movement of education leaders that want to get serious about tackling these racial inequities, we should also be clear that we need help. Right? That having just conversations amongst ourselves may not be cutting it. That it's time for us to really broaden out the game to think about what other sort of partners outside of campus can we be bringing into the conversation, right? How do we break the silo and not just try to solve it here, but also figure out ways to solve it outside of campus? And one place that I would recommend that we start to look is with community organizations and community organizing groups up and down the state. One of the things that we have the benefit of that very few counties have or states have is actually an extraordinarily robust and sophisticated community organizing infrastructure up and down the state. And these people are trained to look at both campus issues and community issues at the same time, right? So why not figure out ways for us to bind these conversations together and to figure out new ways to partner in these two different ways, okay? So that's it for my overview of this Race Counts project. What I'd like to now do is to kind of transition to the panel to help us dig a little bit deeper about what this kind of partnership can look like. I'm going to ask you all to help me join to welcome a few people on stage, a couple people. One of our favorite ECE champions from First 5 LA, Kim Patillo-Brownson. And then a longtime partner and what I think is one of the best thinkers and doers in community organizing, Area Montes Rodriguez, and help me welcome them on stage. Right. Thank you, guys. So just to get us started and get the conversation warmed up, if you could just introduce yourselves and your organization, and then we can go from there.
Sure. I'm Kim Patillo-Brownson. I am the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at First 5 LA. First 5 LA's mission is to ensure that all 700,000 young children in LA County start school ready to succeed and then succeed in later life. We do this as an agent of change, of systems change and policy change. We work at the local level in many partnerships with the county, and we are also a public grant maker.
And good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation with you and Kim, John. A little bit about me. I'm Executive Vice President at Community Coalition, a social justice organization that was founded to deal with the crack epidemic in 1990, and we focus on organizing everyday people, educating them around the issues that are most pressing, and waging action campaigns to address quality of life issues that can lead to real transformation in the community. And a little bit about myself, I have been at Community Coalition for 2 decades. I came to South Central LA as a child in the late 70s, and I attended public schools in the LAUSD during the 1980s and 90s. And I was one of a small number of children that were tracked for college when I was in the 5th grade. I was growing up during the height of the crack epidemic that devastated many communities throughout the country, but particularly hit hard the African American community in South Los Angeles. And by the time I got to high school, I was bussed out of my community to the east side to Roosevelt High School. It was a campus that was built for 1,800 students, but there were 5,000 students at my school, and nearly 5,000 students. And I didn't realize at the time that only students who were in the magnet program, there were about 250 of us, that those were the students that were being tracked for college. The rest, were students that were just going to school doing what they needed to do, but really tracked for dead-end labor or the informal economy. And I share that because I think that that's why I've been at my organization for 2 decades. I came to Community Coalition working with our youth organizing, and our youth leaders at Community Coalition who are part of South Central Youth Empowered Through Action have been working on educational equity issues since the mid-1990s. I don't know if folks remember when Prop BB, Better Buildings, passed in '97. It was for modernization of schools and construction and repairs. Our young people discovered that while there was all of this new funding, South LA schools were not slated to receive any of the funding, and so they organized and exposed the inequity in the funding allocations and got $153 million for repairs to South LA and Southeast LA schools. And for us, the educational equity work is not just about dollars. Our young people have really led the fight to get the LAUSD to guarantee all students A through G courses, college prep courses as a default curriculum and as a civil rights for all students. Our young people have also been at the forefront with the Brothers and Selves Coalition to end the school-to-prison pipeline by ending willful defiance and establishing a school climate bill of rights, to end the disproportionate suspension and expulsions of African American and Latino youth, especially young men. And lastly, our students and parents have really been a part of bringing new revenue to the state. So they were part, Community Coalition is an anchor organization and a part of California Calls and Alliance that played a critical role in the passage of Prop 30, bringing an additional $6 billion in funding for public services, especially education. So I can stop there.
Yeah, but that's what we're talking about. Those kinds of wins, those kinds of achievements from community organizing, we should just take a moment to appreciate that for Ardea. Thank you. Come on now. Come on. I should also disclose, Ardea and I have been learning and working with Ardea for over a decade. And then Kim was priorly with the Advancement Project. Being John Kim and Kim Patillo Brownson, it always got a little confusing. So, but before she moved on to First 5 LA, she was with us. Let me actually ask the both of you guys just to talk a little bit about this idea of equity, and particularly about race and that as a lens. How do you guys see that playing out in your work, and how can we use it in terms of charting out the agenda moving forward?
So it's funny, I was, as I'm sure many folks in this room have been looking at the Getting Down to Facts reports that have come out in the last couple of weeks. And they have a really, I think, eloquent and very lawyerly description of sort of how to define equity. But I think the more common way that many of us resonate to it is that it is basically synonymous with the notion of fundamental fairness. That it is about justice, it is about a notion of actually giving kids a fair shot. What's interesting, though, is that sometimes I think the assumption is that the absence of oppression or the absence of injustice means that you have justice. And I think we define it differently, which is that it's not enough to just have an absence of injustice. You have to have the presence of meaningful opportunities. And so First 5 LA's work really works and centers on this frame of opportunity, and making sure that opportunities aren't just something that exist on paper and that are ephemeral or theoretical, but are something that families and children can actually access to see themselves having a path to social mobility, to having a path towards fairness, and to live beyond whatever their current space in life might be, which I think also then, of course, creates better senses of investment that all folks in our society would actually have the same. In terms of race, it's sort of an interesting reflection. So last summer, I went to Canada with my family when Charlottesville happened and when all of the Tiki Torch Klan rallies happened. And what was interesting, I mean, other than the jarring sort of memory of all of that, to come back from a place where the Canadians were looking at us like, what is going on in your country? But then to come back to California, part of, I think, what was also jarring was a sense that we're fine in California because we don't have Klan rallies. And that is such an embarrassingly low bar to think about justice. It is something that certainly I don't want in our state, but it is so much more necessary to think about what the structures of opportunity look like for us as a state, and to think about what this common refrain around resistance actually should mean. It's striking to me that, and I'm not picking on him, but in some of the back and forth with Governor Brown and President Trump, there was a whole set of conversations around climate change. And I think there's a lot of energy and fun around Governor Brown going to DC and saying, if the federal government won't keep the satellites going to track climate change, then California will launch our own darn satellites. And that is, as a Californian feeling ourselves, right? There's some fun in that, but no one stood up and said, we're going to launch our own 6 million school children and have them do something more profound. No one's saying that the resistance should be won with child investments. No one is saying that that is the core of our future. And so I think part of what I'm thinking about in terms of making sure that we don't sit into our self-congratulation too much is that we have to actually continue to invest and actually make our resistance and our sense of equity more meaningful and powerful and a lived experience for kids in California.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah.
I agree with you, Kim. And I think that for us, we really see equity as the elimination of poverty through equitable educational opportunities. And for us, the public education is a real concrete, it's a real system that can equalize and give greater opportunity, especially to Black and brown children, to children of color. You know, in your presentation, John, you talked about just the decades of disinvestment, right? Because of the effects of Prop 13, and then also just the recessions that we experienced in the 1990s and then in 2008. And for us, communities like South Los Angeles and East Los Angeles have taken the greatest hits when those recessions have happened. But for us, the piece around race and racial equity is central to the work that we do, because over and over, and your maps actually show the racial disparity, the segregation that we see in schools in the LAUSD, where some of our schools, even though we are a Black-brown community, we have some of our schools where it's like 93% Latino students and the remaining 8% African-American students, right? And when we hear students talk about their experiences on the campuses, what they share out is that, you know, in their schools, a lot of times they're treated as problems, not as students. They're criminalized, not encouraged. They're seen for their deficits and not engaged around the stress that they're coming to schools with, but rather, you know, just they feel a sense that there's very low expectations for what they're supposed to do. And so for us, equity is really about challenging those sentiments. And after Prop 30 passed and LCFF, you know, was approved for us, that actually baked equity into a funding formula. And it really pushed us to respond to what the students and parents were saying, that it was time for us to stop, you know, saying that students have to continue to wait till the economy gets better for equity, for them to feel equity. And so we actually formed an equity alliance with Advancement Project and Inner City Struggle. And Kim was actually still with us at that time, at the table at that time. And we said, you know, we actually need to push the district to not look at just post-recession meeting adequacy levels, but actually talk about equity and really put forward what real adequacy would look like, what real per pupil student spending needs to look like, because the truth is that our public education system, including the LAUSD, is still sorely underfunded. And so for us, racial equity in reforming education is a critical part of what we need to do to equalize and create opportunities for students.
Thank you. So Kim, in the Getting Down to Facts 2, so it does clearly lay out what a lot of us have been struggling with for many years, that high levels of disparities are already sort of, you know, set upon for students before they walk into kindergarten. So how do you see the field responding to this dynamic? What can First Fives do in particular to push this conversation downfield?
Sure. So actually, I'll back up and maybe just give a high-level overview first, which is that Getting Down to Facts 2, which was released a week ago, 2 weeks ago, had a number of technical reports and summary briefs, including early care and education, and found that California is woefully underpreparing its children, especially in the early elementary ages, that there are racial disparities, that there are socioeconomic disparities, and that part of that is driven by a lack of access to early learning opportunities, and then also by a lack of fortitude in some of the early learning experiences that some of the children have had. I think what that really, in some ways, highlights is this idea that the educational spectrum is not a series of short sprints where each sector gets to run their own side of it. It is a relay race. It is a baton pass between early learning and K-12. And the sense of Martin Luther King's idea of a web of interdependency is so acutely obvious in the data around early learning and the early elementary grades. What's also, I think, noteworthy is about a year ago, RAND published sort of a evaluation of evaluations and came out with the finding that over 100 studies now have shown that early learning is a viable and impactful intervention that actually makes sure that children have positive child outcomes that last through their early elementary and broader academic careers. And so in some ways, I think the challenge to think about is not whether we have enough data or the right data, but do we have political will? And do we have a sense that these interventions that have been shown to be effective in multiple situations, in multiple states, rural, urban, suburban, with kids of color, with white kids, across the board, that these are effective interventions, and yet we are still underinvesting and below the level of children served before we were at the 2008 recession. I think part of the strategy of the First Fives has been to actually reach out and think about partnerships, because there is a recognition that no sector can do this alone, and that we are stronger together if we can actually push for this together. Because I don't think any K-12 leader aspires to be a champion of remediation. No one wants that mantle, right? What we all want is for our kids to come in strong and ready, and to have the benefit of having good foundational experiences, and also that we seize this opportunity that is 0 to 5. So 90% of a child's brain architecture grows in those first 5 years. And so as you think about equity, the idea that we are, as a society, countenancing a choice to essentially grow greater capacity among our upper income segments of the population, and allowing other kids to not grow that same capacity. And there's very few places where you could imagine that sitting well with anyone. But the political coalition building, I think, is absolutely critical, and has shown, I think, a growing trend to think of these two as parts of the same solution to a common problem.
Area, as a leader in South LA, just talking about this intersection between what's going on in the community and what's going on campuses, anything you can share about what you're seeing as what these students are really bringing in with them when they come into their classrooms?
Around challenges?
Yes, indeed.
So, I had a really difficult and then inspiring meeting on Friday, late afternoon. One of our youth leaders who has been at the forefront of the Equity is Justice campaign and the Brother Son Self work around school climate and restorative justice, she's wanted to meet with me because we organize at all of the South LA high schools, and then young people come to Community Coalition to learn organizing skills and youth development, and we also provide them academic support. And the youth leader called a meeting with me because he wanted to check in with me about how we handled a situation with a young woman, African American, who had been having behavioral issues. And he also wanted to clear the air because we had intervened with him because we had learned that he had experimented with cannabis over the summer. And so we talked to his mom and worked with him, and we're making sure that, you know, it was an experimental one-time thing and not something that was gonna negatively affect him. And so he called the meeting with me to check in about both of these things. And as we were talking, and he's talking about how, you know, good he feels about his leadership on the campaigns, he starts sharing about his family situation and says that he, his sister, and his mom were on the verge of homelessness, that their rent had increased by a significant amount, and his mom couldn't afford to pay rent. And fortunately, a fellow church member allowed the three of them to move into a small room in her house with one bed. And he said, so if I have to do homework, you know, I have to do my homework on the bed. That's why I'm here at Community Coalition whenever I'm not in school, because I have a desk here, I have a computer, I have access to the internet, and since I don't have a phone, you know, I can do my work. I just finished applying to my second college scholarship. And you know, when I was hearing this story and he's wanting to talk about their leadership and making sure that I'm being fair to, you know, his peer who's in the youth organizing, and he's really concerned about his mom's mental well-being because she's depressed that she can't provide them adequate housing. Like, just for that moment of interaction, I realized this is an exceptional young man who is really doing well and thriving, but he's describing his situation is not unique. It's the reason why we have done all of our educational equity work. It's the reason why we've partnered with other educational equity organizations to build a student voice, to build a parent voice in the education discussion. These family issues and economic stressors that the young people are experiencing, they're coming to school with them. And what we hear over and over is that the schools don't have a space to acknowledge the stressors that they're bringing, the trauma that they experience, and that they don't see a lot of spaces in the community to deal with those needs either. And so for us, when Prop 30 passed and LCFF got approved, and for the first time we saw that the state was not penalizing schools for students bringing these types of issues with them to the classroom, we really believe that this is an opportunity for us to continue to push and to say that districts have an opportunity to address these needs, to target investments to meet the needs not just of students like Fernando, but also students that are, you know, foster youth and English learners, so that they can feel more supported and better prepared to do well when in school.
So we're coming to the end of time for the panel, but just a last sentiment in terms of bright spots. What gives you hope on this? It's a daunting task that we're all endeavoring on. But Kim, what gives you hope? Where are some bright spots for you?
So I'm going to actually connect it back to the earlier discussion around equity, and I think I see Dean Tagawa, so I'm going to embarrassing and call you out immediately. But there are really interesting models that are already working, that have an incredible evidence base. LAUSD's prior preschool program was actually born out of a DSEG order from the 1970s. And there's this notion that early learning is somehow something new, as opposed to something that was around before I was born. And I think what's also really phenomenal is that there is, I think, a newfound optimism about the need to think about hearing the quality that is necessary. So to your point, not one size fits all is not something that I think is a catchy idea. It is a notion that if in Head Start, children who have a need for wraparound mental health services or dental services or nutrition services, the idea is that you tier services to meet a child where they are so they can be successful. And that is a really important idea whose time has come, that has lived in the early childhood space for quite some time. And the social-emotional learning part of education, I think, is something that K-12 and early childhood can collaborate on quite well.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about the Student Equity Need Index win at the LAUSD with $260 million that will be applied towards the index as of 2019. And there's, you know, a menu of services that the community that has been informed by the organizing of students and parents and the information of administrators. And so for us, what I see as a bright spot is that keeping students and parents and community engaged and marrying that with the data that illuminates need and what a path forward can look like is something that we should all be excited about. It's something that everyone who's working on educational equity, educational justice issues should really get behind. This is a time to continue to push forward because students and parents have fought, have been fighting for decades to improve public education, and public education is the way for us to really, fight against and challenge and eliminate poverty and racism.
So it certainly is, as I mentioned, a daunting task for us. How do we go beyond just our rhetoric as leading the resistance, or our rhetoric around this idea that we're holding the progressive future for this country? But how do we actually dig into some of these issues on campus and outside of it so that we actually make this Golden State shine brightly for all of our students? But when I think about our chances, and I think about having partners like these up here on stage and so many of the partners of you all in the room, I'm starting to feel encouraged. I'm starting to feel like we got some pretty good chances. So if you guys can help me thank our two panelists before we move on. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, so before I leave the stage, I've been asked to help us transition. And talking about great leaders, I really have the privilege to help introduce this next piece. After the 2016 election, this country and the politics of this country sort of flipped on its head. To this day, and last week was certainly no exception, we have constantly been rocked to our cores about what we see out of this administration on a nearly hourly basis. I've said this time and time again, I could barely stand and look at my phone without sort of being traumatized about what new lows are being established for this country and our democracy. But too many Americans and too many Californians, the impact went far beyond just being a political one. For many, there was a palpable and very real sense of fear spreading through all quarters of their lives, from dropping off their kids in the morning to showing up to work, to boarding a plane, to attending school. This administration and their rhetoric and their policies have represented an existential threat to many of them in their daily existence. As a reaction, many went underground, to make themselves even more invisible to avoid the danger. But some of them decided to step up and fight back. And when we speak of what gives me hope, it's some of these young folks that you'll be hearing from today because of the fact that they decided to be brave, to step forward, and to fight on behalf of all of their fellow students. Early in this administration, we saw leaders across California step up and signal a sense of sanctuary and inclusion to the besieged. The California Department of Education immediately released the Safe Haven Initiative to provide support and guidance to LEAs about how to protect undocumented students in particular from the actions of this administration. And while that was an extraordinary step to be sure, there was an immediate growth from CDE and many other parts of the state about how we needed to expand this idea or this thought around sanctuary, that there were other student populations beyond the undocumented that also had a heightened level of fear and triggering and loathing because of this administration, and some student populations that had been struggling well before 45 took office. We're talking about Muslim students, we're talking about Black students, LGBTQ students, indigenous students, all searching for a welcoming and safe space. Therefore, the Advancement Project California was extraordinarily grateful to be able to partner with the California Department of Education and youth organizing groups up and down the state to have a different kind of conversation, one led by these youth leaders, about what they truly need to feel welcomed and safe at their schools. In the wake of their leadership, we are honored to find many organizations up and down the state that wanted a partner to think about what it means to be welcoming and to be inclusive for all the students of the state. And so after a year of this conversation, we're proud to have some of these youth leaders here today to help us publicly launch this new initiative called Welcoming and Safe Schools for All.